They were sleeping, July 23rd, 1993, downtown Rio de Janeiro, steps of the Candelária Church. It was the early hours of the morning. Some children slept wrapped in pieces of cardboard. Others were talking, laughing, planning the next day. Street kids, invisible to most people until two cars pulled up. Headlights on, doors opened, and in seconds what had been an ordinary dawn turned into terror. Gunshots, people running, screams, bodies falling. When the silence returned, 8 young people were dead. Brazil woke up to the news, and so did the world. But this story doesn't begin that night. It begins long before. It begins with abandonment, with extreme poverty, with children who learned to survive on the streets. Who were they? They were not criminals. They were not a threat. They were children, most between 11 and 19 years old, boys who slept on the church steps because they had nowhere else to go. They worked as informal parking attendants, sold candy, asked for spare change, and survived however they could. Candelária was a meeting point. There they found some sense of belonging, some collective protection, some humanity. The context of the time, early 1990s, Rio de Janeiro immersed in social crisis, high crime rates, frequent police violence, and a narrative gaining strength. A good criminal is a dead criminal. That phrase didn't come out of nowhere. It was fueled by collective fear, by a sense of insecurity, and by a police force unprepared and often uncontrolled. That week, according to reports, there had been a previous incident. A stone had allegedly been thrown at a police vehicle. A provocation, nothing that justified what would come next, but enough to feed retaliation. The execution. The vehicle stopped, men got out, armed, and opened fire on unarmed teenagers. Some tried to run, others hid behind pillars. But there was no chance. It was quick, cold, direct. The target was not a specific person. It was the group. It was their presence there. It was the idea of cleaning up. And that word hurts, because it reveals intent. Some survived. Among them, a boy who would later become a symbol of the tragedy. Sandro Barbosa do Nascimento, yes. The same Sandro who years later would hijack bus 174. He was there. He saw friends die. He ran. He survived. But he carried it forever. And that shows how trauma does not disappear. It accumulates. The national reaction. The images spread around the world. The UN spoke out. Human rights organizations applied pressure. Brazil was under the spotlight. It was not just a crime, it was an extrajudicial execution, and there was strong suspicion of police involvement. Investigations began. Witnesses spoke. Survivors recognized faces. And little by little, what seemed like rumor became formal accusation. Military police officers and former officers were indicted, and that made the case even more explosive, because when those who are supposed to protect are accused of killing, social trust collapses. But this story goes even deeper, because it's not just about gunshots. It's about structural abandonment, about a stolen childhood, about a state absent during the day and violent at night. And now, let's enter the trials, the convictions, the acquittals, and the question that still divides opinions today. Was there justice, or merely a symbolic response to international pressure? When the state is on trial. After the early hours of July 23, 1993, all of Brazil wanted answers. It wasn't just a massacre, it was suspected execution. And when signs emerged that police officers were involved, the question changed. It was no longer who did it. It was, were those who were supposed to protect killing? The investigation's witnesses stated they had recognized some of the shooters. Survivors reported details. Cars similar to those described were identified. And gradually, names began to surface. Military police officers and former officers were indicted. International pressure was enormous. Human rights organizations demanded transparency. The UN monitored the case. Brazil was under the spotlight. But investigating police officers is different. There is corporatism, there is fear, there is witness intimidation. And in cases like this, every testimony is a risk. Some survivors changed their statements. Others disappeared from the radar. The atmosphere was tense. The trial. The first trials took place years later, and the outcome divided opinions. Some defendants were convicted. Others were acquitted due to lack of evidence. One of the main defendants, former officer Marcos da Silva, was sentenced to more than 200 years in prison, but not all those involved received similar sentences, and that reignited the feeling of incomplete justice. Did the system work, or only partially? Because when a crime involves state agents, public trust depends on transparency, and any doubt becomes fuel for disbelief. The culture of cleaning up. There was an expression circulating in the 1990s, social cleansing. It was whispered, but it was real. The idea that children living on the streets were a problem to be eliminated, not protected. This was not official policy, but it was a mindset present in certain sectors. And when that mindset meets weapons and authority, the result can be devastating. The survivor who returned to the spotlight. Among the survivors was Sandro Barbosa do Nascimento. He was only 15. He saw friends die. He fled. He survived. But the trauma remained. Years later, he would become the central figure in the hijacking of Bus 174. And that raises a painful reflection. What happens when the state fails the same person twice? First, by abandoning them, then by shooting at them. That does not justify anything Sandro would do later, but it explains the cycle: abandonment, violence, trauma, explosion. The cycle repeats when it is not interrupted. International impact. The massacre became a global symbol of violence against street children. International NGOs began pressuring Brazil. The Child and Adolescent Statute, created a few years earlier, gained renewed focus. Society began to more seriously discuss public policies for minors at risk. But discussion is not an immediate solution. What changed? After the case, there were limited reforms. Social programs were expanded. The issue gained visibility. But police violence did not disappear. The homeless population did not stop growing, and the question remains, did we learn enough? Because the Candelária Massacre was not an accident. It was a consequence of extreme inequality, a consequence of social abandonment, a consequence of a culture that dehumanizes those living on the margins. Let's close this story with its legacy, what remained in the collective memory, what still echoes through the streets of Rio, and why this case continues to be one of the most emblematic in Brazilian history, because the most frightening part is not only what happened, it's what can still happen if nothing changes. The country that looked away. Some crimes shock, others reveal. But the Candelária Massacre did something even greater. It forced Brazil to look at itself in the mirror, and the reflection was not pretty. What remained after the gunshots? 8 young people dead, several injured, families without answers, a church marked forever. But what truly remained was the question, would these deaths have caused the same outrage without international pressure? Because for years, children living on the streets had already been victims of violence, but almost no one filmed it, almost no one reported it, almost no one cared, until the world began to look. The church as a symbol. Candelária Church ceased to be just a tourist attraction. It became a memorial. It became an urban scar. To this day, when someone climbs those steps, there is memory there. Memory that those children were not hidden. They were in the city center, in plain sight, and still they were invisible. Justice complete or partial. Some were convicted, others acquitted, some appealed. Some served part of their sentences, but for many people there was never a full sense of justice, because when a crime involves state agents, expectations are higher, and any failure weighs twice as much. The case showed that punishing police officers is possible, but it also revealed how difficult it is. Witnesses afraid, fragile evidence, contradictory accounts, and a system that does not always protect those who speak out. The domino effect. After Candelária, intense debates about police violence followed. International reports followed. Promises of reform followed. But Brazilian reality remained complex. Inequality did not disappear. The homeless population did not stop growing. And police confrontations continued to occur. Does that mean nothing changed? No. Visibility changed. The debate changed. International awareness changed. But structural change is slow and often insufficient. The invisible child. Perhaps the greatest lesson of the Candelária Massacre is this: when a society begins to see certain children as a problem, the risk increases, because dehumanization is the first step toward violence. If you see someone as an obstacle, you begin to justify excesses, and when excesses become routine, tragedies stop being exceptions. The survivor who carried the trauma. Among those who escaped was Sandro Barbosa do Nascimento. He survived that early morning, but years later he would star in another tragedy broadcast live, and that is not simple coincidence. It is a cycle. Abandoned child, traumatized child, explosive adult. Untreated trauma becomes a ticking time bomb that does not turn an aggressor into an eternal victim, but it shows that violence generates violence, and that abandonment has a cost. The question that still echoes today: how many children are still sleeping on Brazil's streets? How many are still ignored? How many are still seen as a problem rather than a collective responsibility? Because Candelária was not just a massacre, it was a warning that when the state fails to protect and then fails to restrain, the result can be irreversible. The legacy. The Candelária Massacre became a milestone in the discussion of human rights in Brazil. It became a reference in books. It became an academic study. It became a documentary. But it should not be only historical memory. It should be a permanent warning, because what happened that early morning did not begin with the first gunshot. It began with social abandonment, with invisibility, with inequality. The gunshot was the final stage of something that had already been growing. Closing. If this story moved you, share it, because remembering prevents repetition. Subscribe to the channel. Here we do not turn pain into spectacle. We turn memory into reflection, and in the next video, we will dive into another case that shows how decisions made in seconds can change generations. See you there, and until then, never treat any life as invisible.